From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 56. We've had a lot of requests for a catching specific episode, and we finally delivered on that. We've got one of the really bright minds in the catching world talking to us today, a guy I've had a chance to work with in person quite a bit of late, and you're going to see his expertise up close as we talk today. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients to support your body's nutritional needs across 5 critical areas: energy, immunity, gut health, hormonal support, and healthy aging. I'm an avid user of Athletic Greens myself, in spite of the fact that I tend to be a supplement minimalist. To me, this is a product that is much more like whole food nutritional insurance as opposed to a true supplement. The ingredients have been carefully selected at the highest quality, most natural source. You get essential vitamins and minerals, digestive enzymes, prebiotics, probiotics, and that's the zero compromise approach from the company. It's plant-based, sourced from whole foods at the highest quality, so you won't find harmful chemicals, artificial colors or flavors, preservatives, or added sugar. Really, it's perfect for folks who are gluten and dairy-free, paleo, keto, vegan-friendly, great for people who are intermittent fasting, all that fun stuff. Personally, I love it for obviously our athletes who don't get enough nutritional benefits from fruits and vegetables because they don't eat enough. So it's a way to kind of plug in holes in diets. But also, I really like it for our college and professional athletes who may have complex travel schedules where quality food options aren't always at hand. On a personal level, I'm a husband, father of 3, and an entrepreneur. We split our time between 2 states, and I'm also still an avid lifter. So life is inherently crazy, and it can be stressful, and sleep deprivation is definitely something that we encounter. So I rely on Athletic Greens for part of my immune support, and believe firmly that it's made a big difference in keeping me healthy in spite of how crazy our lifestyle is. They've got a great offer in place. If you head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey, they'll get you 20 free travel packets with your purchase. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, and you can claim your special offer. Today's guest was raised in Washington State and played 4 years of college baseball among Green River College, Everett Community College, and Central Washington University. He graduated from Central Washington with a Bachelor of Science in Physical Education and School Health. He then coached 2 years of high school baseball and then returned to Everett Community College as an assistant coach in 2009. He spent 2010 as an assistant coach at Central Washington University and then moved back to Green River College as the head baseball coach for the 2011 season. From 2012 through 2017, he served in various roles for the University of Washington baseball program. In 2015, he founded D1 Catching, an independent catching, coaching, and consultation business. He was hired as a full-time assistant at Santa Clara University in the summer of 2017 and then moved to professional baseball when he was hired by the Minnesota Twins as their minor league catching coordinator in November of 2017. In November of 2019, he was hired by the New York Yankees to serve as their major league quality control coach and catching coordinator. Please welcome to the show, Tanner Swanson.
Welcome to the show, Tanner.
Hey, Eric, how you doing?
I'm
Happy
good.
to be here.
I appreciate you helping me pass the time on this quarantine while neither of us can see each other in Tampa or New York.
No, this is the next best thing, so I'm eager to chalk it up a little bit.
I figure it's a good chance to catch up on continuing education, both for us and then for the rest of the world. So hopefully we can provide some good content. And we've had a lot of actual requests for a catching specific episode. So you're the guy I talk to the most about catching, so you're a logical place to start. So we'll jump right into it.
Let's roll.
All right. So let's start like big picture first. All right. So what's the most valuable trait that a catcher can offer to his team?
I think the common answer, I've been asked this quite a bit in the past and, similar platforms or interviews or whatnot. And I think the go-to typically is leadership. It's field presence. It's you need somebody who has the ability to manage a staff and to navigate a game and a lineup. And while I think all those things are really important, I wouldn't discredit leadership ever. I think probably the key, I think anytime we're talking about players and talking about player development and how we can make adjustments and improve a particular player, I think everything has to come back to kind of performance. So I think competence is probably the most valuable trait. It's, are you good at your job? Do you possess the skill sets that are required to play the position at a high level? And I think if you do those things, if your skill set is polished and you perform well and you help your team win physically, I think that gives you a greater capacity to then do those other things, to lead others, to to manage, be kind of the coach on the field, as you would say. But I think everything needs to come back to performance. It's how well do you perform the tasks that are required to do your job. And I think if you do that, and if that's always the focal point, then everything else seems to kind of fall into place.
And when you talk about, performance, you obviously stratify that into a number of different categories. So when you look at how a catcher performs, like, how are you breaking that out? What are your key competencies that you're looking at individually to see where guys can improve or where they may be elite?
The basic, the big three would be the receiving, blocking, throwing. I mean, those things, just by sheer frequency, happen the most often. And those are the most talked about and usually the most trained, I would say. And among those things, I think, what impacts performance the most is pitch framing or receiving. And that's gotten, a lot of attention, over the last few years, more so than previously. I think just as metrics advance and we have a better understanding of just the impact that a strike or an added strike can have, on an at bat, an inning, throughout the course of a game, throughout the course of a season. I think light has been shed on, guys who do that skill well, how big of an impact that has on, really the bottom line. So I think pitch framing is the premium. It's not only, the skill that you'll do the most often, but just from a run value standpoint, it has the greatest impact on run prevention, which is ultimately, what we're chasing.
And obviously that's taken, a time to get to the forefront. I mean, nobody was really talking about that, 15 years ago, but I'm curious. So you've gone from obviously the college setting, into the professional setting. Now your second organization is, was there a moment or a specific scenario where you started to observe it? Like, was this as high a priority for you while you were at Washington, or did it become more apparent when you got to pro ball?
Definitely more apparent once I got into pro ball. I think my time with Minnesota, was really opened my eyes to, just the possibilities, in terms of how we can, utilize the information that's at our fingertips to maybe rethink, things that we've done in the past or how we can improve training environments and potentially even methods that we employ, during the game. And so when I was at Washington, I think like a lot of catching coaches or a lot of coaches in general, like I really was striving to help our guys be generalists in a lot of ways. We wanted to be really good at everything, at those big three. We wanted to be elite receivers, elite blockers, elite throwers, and really just trying to create the most dynamic catcher, possible. And I think in some ways I failed our guys by, I think generalists, we can scratch the surface on a lot of different things, but we fail to really nail one thing. And I think when I got to Minnesota, really when I got into pro ball, that one thing or that main thing, really became apparent in terms of, what is the most valuable? Where do we need to spend, a majority of our resources and from a training standpoint, to really try to reap the most benefits. And that is receiving. I think that's pretty clear. I think the cat's out of the bag on that. But I really didn't start thinking in those terms until I jumped into professional baseball and now had just access to more data, more people, more resources, more analysts who really helped kind of change my perspective.
Absolutely. Do you think, when you look to the younger levels, like, is receiving still paramount importance if you're talking about, a Division III college program or, I've seen first round high school kids and it's, catchers are terrified. The hitters are terrified, but you have guys back there who look like they're wearing toasters on their hands trying to receive. And you wind up seeing, 25 strikeouts in a 7-inning game because there's so many drop third strikes and base runners as a result of it. So does pitch training, does it become de-emphasized at that level where, at the high school ranks, you would focus a heck of a lot more on receiving, blocking, or actually just receiving, period, not necessarily framing?
That's an interesting question. I think it's complicated. I think it depends ultimately, like a lot of things, it depends on the goal, right? If the goal is winning, there's probably more opportunity to add strikes, manipulate umpires, stretch the strike zone, by refining a player's receiving ability. But often at the younger levels, winning isn't the priority, or at least it shouldn't be. It's about development and learning the game, et cetera. So, when that tipping point occurs, is, I think, a tricky question that I don't know if I have the answer to, but, I think at the younger levels, in my opinion, it would make more sense to really focus on just the fundamental development of refining the scope of skills that are required to play the position. And then as you develop, advance, into higher levels, you can really start to prioritize, which of those skills, become the premium and how you can leverage those,
That's awesome.
more often.
And so obviously you came in at Washington, you came into Minnesota, and you've come into New York. When you come into a new situation, how do you go about evaluating the catchers on a roster? What are the first things you like to look at?
I look at usually, in two parts. Like the first, even before I ever meet a player, there's so much information available at this level that, the data, the performance measures will really paint a pretty good picture, about what this player is, or at least what he is to the industry or the organization, in terms of how he performs on the field. Now that doesn't always tell the whole story. There's other compounding effects of being a good teammate and how you work and how you go about your business and how you influence others. And so there's obviously multiple layers to this, but I think the foundation goes back to performance. How do you perform on the field? And I think, it's hard to run from your metrics. It's hard to run from your statistics. And I think now from a defensive standpoint, as we evaluate catchers, it's becoming much easier to identify, who performs at what level and who are the elite and who are impacting run prevention the most and who's impacting it the least and what are their strengths and weaknesses. And so that's the first thing I dive into is I try to create a profile of, okay, who is this person as a player? What do their framing metrics look like? Are there any deficiencies? Do their strengths line up to, what the game's elite strengths are? Are they the same strengths? Are they good at the right things? The things that impact performance the most, which would be, the receiving or pitch framing. It's how do they perform, in that realm? And are there any kind of low hanging fruit, or quick hitters things that we could fix quickly to maybe draw, to maybe improve, their framing ability immediately? Is there a small adjustment, that would yield great gains or is, a major transformation or overhaul maybe needed? And so who is the player kind of statistically? And then the second piece to that is arguably more important. It's who is the person and trying to, dive into getting to know, the player on an individual level and gain a better understanding, for what they value, and what makes them tick and what are things that, how are they great self-assessors? Do they realize what their strengths are? or what they struggle with. How has their game changed or evolved over time? I think that says a lot about, a particular individual. Are they the same player today as they were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or have they continued to find ways to adapt and evolve? So I think all these things, start to tell you, okay, who is this person, and how can we take the information we know about the individual and about what we know about the player, and how do we find a marriage between those two things, and to ultimately, find that barrier, or that barrier of entry where, we can propose certain adjustments or things to help, further develop the player moving forward. So I think the timing of that's the art, I think, of coaching is knowing when that window is present, and then how to capitalize on it, when the door is open.
I'm curious, so one of the things that I think inherently this podcast becomes somewhat like pitcher bias, which is unfair because you can't have a good pitcher without a good catcher. But one of the things that we've kind of talked about is mechanics are incredibly heavily debated, right? People can argue about what's good, what isn't. And for some reason, there's still a lot of coaches that like to go to that first, and they want to overhaul things instead of tinkering. So, in that world, maybe you have a scenario where a huge adjustment would be having a pitcher just go to the other side of the rubber, right? It completely changes absolutely everything. Whereas there are subtle things that may be a little like adjustment to the glove side, or maybe starting them a little bit more externally rotated in their hip if they have retroverted hips, some of those things. I'm curious, like for you alluded to like low-hanging fruit versus massive overhauls. Like what's a low-hanging fruit? Is it moving a guy up 6 inches closer to the plate? Is it changing their setup so that, they don't have to take such aggressive routes? And, what are the low-hanging fruits, and what are the dramatic overhauls where you don't want to necessarily jump to them without checking the smaller boxes first?
I think, some of the lower hanging fruit would be, okay, what are we doing, from a glove rhythm standpoint, or a trigger, how do we get ready to receive the pitch? And I think a lot of guys, sometimes, have too drastic of pre-pitch glove rhythms where their glove is doing a lot of different things in preparation to catch. And a lot of times, at diminished returns, it's creating poor angles or, poor timing, so trying to maybe simplify or discover, some type of pre-pitch rhythm or lack thereof, to get our glove in a really good position, to again, make the main thing to receive the pitch on time, with a good angle, working the ball back to the plate, et cetera. So, that's one thing I look at immediately. And I think a lot of times guys who struggle to receive pitches at the bottom of the strike zone, you could draw a direct correlation to what their glove is doing, during the pitcher's delivery. And often the glove is climbing, it's working up to then down. And sometimes if we kind of reverse engineer that or look further, back the chain, we can make some modifications to what the glove is doing to hopefully put it in a better position as we work to the attack. So that would be, probably a low-hanging fruit. The big one for me, and you could argue that this is an easy adjustment or an overhaul. On the surface, it appears to be an overhaul, but I think making stance modifications can really transform, a player's ability to receive. And I think often catchers, I think at all levels, are always battling their stances, and they're battling their body and tinkering. I think even guys that are, in the later stages of their college career, early professional career, still don't have a ton of confidence in their stance, by traditional standards. They're making adjustment to their secondary. My glove elbow it feels restricted, against my left knee. How do I create clearance? How do I create freedom? I feel stuck. It's kind of a constant battle. And I think, one thing that we really developed in Minnesota, and I think, I've gotten a lot of, I guess, credit for this, but I think it was a lot of people involved that came together and started to kind of rethink catcher setups and getting a catcher to a knee and finding kind of what is an optimal receiving position then learning how to do our other skills from that position. I think, for a long time, we as an industry kind of attacked the problem maybe backwards, where it was, hey, let's learn how to receive out of our best blocking and throwing position. And I think what the challenges that presents is that it compromises our ability to receive. And I think if you look at framing metrics, and we're probably getting ahead of ourselves here, but this was kind of an aha moment for me, is when I started diving into stances and trying to figure out, okay, what is optimal? What is not optimal? Across the industry, pitch framing metrics drastically decline, with runners on base. So that would be a scenario where catchers universally for the longest time would set up in a traditional secondary stance, which was kind of an up ready stance, which was perceived to be a better position to block and throw from. But still out of that position, a majority of the skill required, or the skill that we can expect to be utilized the most, is receiving. We still receive more out of that secondary stance than we do anything else. And if we know that our framing regresses from these positions, and we know that framing is the most valuable, and we're still not going to block and throw very often, it really made me question, why do we ever get into these positions? It was, seemed counterproductive in a lot of ways. And then that really led me down the path to, hey, can we learn to block and throw from our best receiving position? If that's a one knee setup, great. Can we learn how to block and throw from this position? And I think we're proving, and you're seeing this trend kind of spread throughout the industry, that it is possible. And in a lot of cases, it might even be a more optimal blocking position and or throwing position, as well. And that's been hard for a lot of people to kind of wrap their heads around, because it's different. It was perceived as lazy for the longest time. I think another misconception is that, hey, we don't, if you're doing that, you don't care about blocking and throwing. And I don't think that's, a true representation of what's happening. So I think, for a guy like Mitch Garver, who, you and I have talked about in the past, it's, that was a relatively easy adjustment for him. It was, so you could call that a low hanging fruit, or, conceptually it's a completely different position. But I think a lot of players like that, in my experience, when you put them in some alternative positions, when you put them in a knee down position, they feel really comfortable almost, right away. And it's almost like they've been freed up. And a lot of guys have looked at me saying, we're allowed to do this. Like I've wanted to do this for a long time, and I was never allowed to. And, so there was constraints, put on catchers for a long time, that they had to do it, one way, which was, the way, the perceived optimal way in the past. And so my long-winded answer there is that I think the stance is really, really critical. And a lot of times it inhibits our ability to do certain things, specifically, receive pitches at the bottom of the strike zone, which is, the key.
I think it's interesting too, because I think where the data revolution has been unique is you hear about guys who, from a pitch design standpoint, they understand why they should switch to a 4-seam from a 2-seam or something like that, where the data leads the player to some of these solutions. I feel like with pitch framing, it's something where the players were screaming at us for years about it. I can remember, one of our big leaguers talking about one of the more well-known catchers in the game, who's sensationalized for basically throwing guys out. And I remember talking to him, like, oh, he gets so lazy back there. We lose so many strikes from him. And I mean, this is 7-8 years ago. And it was almost like the players were waiting for the metrics to just come out and be like, this is actually important. Would you agree that they've sensationalized like the throwing aspect of the game so much that we've probably missed out on a lot of really, really good catchers over the years?
Without question. I think, for the longest time, it was the only thing that you could really quantify, from a scouting standpoint, and you could put a number on it, and it was easy to grade, And the other stuff was just much more subjective. And I think a lot of scouts would even tell you that it was a really difficult thing, and is still a really difficult thing at the amateur level to really, put your thumb on and say, no, this guy is going to be an elite, professional receiver. I think the industry now, the awareness level is higher than it's ever been. But I think it's still difficult or challenging to, evaluate it at the younger levels. But I think the industry, I think, has changed the perception that, hey, the classic catch and throw guy who's got a big arm, and looks really athletic in the gear, but maybe doesn't hit, because the offensive profile traditionally at the position has been, really low. I think that's really shifting. I think most organizations now are looking for an offensive player, a player with a higher offensive ceiling, who can receive the baseball and receive it well and can get into good positions to do so. And I think the value of the arm has, is maybe lower on the totem pole than it was, for a long time.
I'm curious, like, what current software are you using to evaluate pitch framing, both professionally, but also in the amateur ranks? Are we there yet, or is there a long way to go?
I think there's still a long way to go. I think the metrics now tell us, who's good and who's not good. But there's still a lot, to be learned about, the why, what are the movement qualities that are correlated to good pitch framers or bad pitch framers. So we don't know specifically, what movements, are optimal. I think in a lot of ways, even myself, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is trial and error. And I think trial and error this was something, again, that was really pushed on me in Minnesota. It was almost mandated, that if you wait to know something is right, then, you'll probably never start. And I think the industry for a long time was, I think, resistant to experimenting with new things, and I think that's completely changed in recent years, and experimentation is promoted, and especially in the minor leagues where, hey, let's do some things, let's act, and see what we learn, and we're not always going to be right, and that's good, and we'll make adjustments, as we go. So, but I think for me, as we search for, hey, what's optimal, what's not optimal, it's really, we're gaming towards, the metrics in a lot of ways. We know that's the end goal, is we're trying to create more strikes. If we do X, we can do X for a certain period of time, and we can monitor the results. Are we gaining more strikes than we were previously or not? And try to draw some causation. And I think one of the great things about framing metrics is that they stabilize, relatively quickly compared to a lot of other metrics, out there. I think just, again, based on the sheer frequency, a catcher receives so many pitches, yeah, that it doesn't take long to know whether, an adjustment, was meaningful, good or bad. Mm-hmm. Whereas from a hitting standpoint or a pitching standpoint, it takes a much longer, period of time to really draw conclusions that, hey, yeah, this added leg kick, or, this adjustment we made in the weight room to get this guy a little bit more external rotation is led to, this impact on his performance. I think it's much harder to do in other spaces. Whereas in pitch framing, it can be done relatively quickly. And that's kind of the approach I took, and continue to take. It's let's make some adjustments, let's make some refinements, and then let's look at the results, and then, and just rinse and repeat, and hopefully continue to, make sure our trend line is moving, up is the end goal.
Is there, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like there's much less variability in the catching world, right? So, you go to pitchers, right? You've got guys who are throwing submarine, you have sidearm guys, you have, super high release points, you have guys that do a dramatically different things. And you have to be really careful with it, because you might, try to coach the different out of somebody, and all of a sudden they lose deception, or they lose, some kind of elite secondary pitch, whatever, as you try to make them a truly efficient four seam or something like that. So right. I'm curious though, are there some how negotiable is a catching stance? You know what I mean? Or a setup? Are there guys that do things when you watch major league games who do things horrifically wrong in terms of either their body positioning, or their glove path to the baseball that still project out well from a metric standpoint? Or is it one of those things where the actions pretty much line up with the outcomes?
I think the later. I mean, there's certainly outliers where there's guys that you'd look at and say visually that doesn't look right. It doesn't look like so and so or other players that are perceived as elite or measure up to be elite, according to the metrics. And but they still perform at a high level, and I think those are unique cases. And I've struggled. I've encountered some of those guys. In the past, and there's this internal struggle that, hey, I think if we do this, even, it can help him even more. But there, you do run the risk of, well, do you take away, what he's already good at? But I think for the most part, like generally, the actions line up with, if you do these things, if we get in really good positions, if our timing's right, if our glove works from below the ball, if we really focus on dominating the bottom third of the strike zone and make that our strength, then everything else kind of comes into place. And I think guys, at the end of the day, if they do a core set of things well, will perform overall well in the grand scheme of things.
This is probably more of a rhetorical statement than a question, but especially because we get to work together. But what type of communication is there with a strength and conditioning staff / medical staff in your history when you're working with a catcher? Do you, if you see a limitation in physical abilities, how do you work to improve that?
I think it's huge, and it's critical to this whole process. And I think especially because of the approach we're taking in terms of setups and encouraging guys to get into, whether it's a one knee setup or some type of kickstand or positions that maybe they haven't got into in the past. In a lot of ways, it's uncharted territory, and we don't have a long history of players that have been catching, within this style to say that, or to really know what to expect. And so I think that communication is a critical piece to understanding, how are they responding, and what kind of modifications can we make in the weight room to maybe access some more range of motion or to, improve recovery or whatever the case may be. But then also, like, what are their movement assessments tell us about the positions that we are asking them to get into and get out of? And if we're asking them to block from a knee down position and they need to, sit in a certain way and they need to create the right leverage with their off leg to drive or propel their body laterally, like what kind of limitations, do we see that might prevent them from being able to do that? And then the more important question is, what do we do about that? And Gary Sanchez, for example, we're not trying to make him Mitch Garver. At least I'm not. That's not my goal. He needs to be the best version of Gary Sanchez. And so on the surface, that might look similar and people can draw those conclusions, outside of our organization, but internally, that's not my goal. And their bodies are built differently. And I've already ran into some roadblocks where, this is what worked for me in the past with guys like Mitch. And for whatever reason, this doesn't feel right. And we need to figure out a different way to do it. And so we start to explore, maybe movement solutions that we haven't even, seen in the past, or that I haven't coached in the past, that kind of just develop organically, again, through that trial and error process. But I think that conversation, needs to include the S&C staff to figure out why, there's limitations and or why it's really easy to get into this position, and why we should encourage more of it, or do we need to take a step back and kind of rethink the positioning and maybe search somewhere else for a better solution.
Yeah, and in terms of just, we have like a lot of like physical therapists and athletic trainers that listen to this. Is one of the things that you appreciate about the one knee and the kickstand approach is like a kickstand's probably going to require like some more hip intern rotation, and the one knee is going to probably require a lot more hip abduction. And certainly both of those are going to be heavily impacted by how well you can posteriorly tilt your pelvis. There's a lot of moving parts. Whereas
Right.
I think a traditional setup was just kind of hang out in the sagittal plane. You need a little bit of hip intern rotation to squat deep, but then you didn't have a whole lot of adjustability, on pitches that you
Right.
had to adapt to because they were, misfires from the pitcher or they were balls in the dirt that you had to get down to block. So, the advent of new stances and an increased focus on framing in a lot of ways has made it even more important that the strength and conditioning and medical staffs really have their catchers ready. I mean, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I always tell folks, like, in terms of both volume and amplitude, catchers have it worse than anybody on the field. They pretty much play every day. They've still got to hit. They still got to throw. They still got to run. But they've got to hang out in a deep squat position for 3.5 hours.
No doubt.
It's physically demanding. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, no question. It's probably the not just physically, but it's probably the most demanding job, maybe in sport, when you start to layer in, all the other responsibilities that these guys have too, from a game planning and, game calling and game calling reviews and advanced hitter meeting. I mean, they're stretched in terms of time. And then add in, the maintenance work that they need to do in the weight room and the recovery stuff. And it's just, there's a lot on these guys' plate.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, I think that the style or approach that we're taking, one of my goals is that it's going to relieve some of that stress. And we're going to get into this knee down position is going to be over the course of time, less stressful and hopefully, take less of a toll on our body and allow us to really maintain, throughout not only the course of a game, but the course of a long professional season. So we don't peak or wear down, towards the end when it matters the most. And we can get in a really comfortable position, a repeatable position that we can, again, just make the main thing and kind of build everything, off that foundation.
A while back, you made a comment. I actually have the email I'm reading it from, but you said, you mentioned like an aha moment where, and you already referred to, like, from a framing standpoint that, there shouldn't be this regression in framing with runners on base. And once you appreciate that, you talked about getting down that path and starting to focus on merging different stances together until you realize that you could make later decisions on secondary skills and thus stay committed to receiving longer. So
Right.
Elaborate on that a little bit more for me. It's like, did it change the way that you prepared guys as well? Like when you made that realization?
No question. I presented at the ABCA convention in Anaheim, several years ago. I think it was maybe 2017. And I'd tell any listeners to scrap that presentation. If I had to get up there again, it would be completely different. And hopefully if I said this same thing 5 years from now, like, whatever I'm saying today would also change. That's just, I think, a goal of mine is to try to continue to adapt and evolve. But when I was at Washington, my entire goal, like I said previously, was to try to create really dynamic, versatile catchers who could do everything. And in that, a lot of our training and much of my presentation was about creating chaos and variability in training to try to kind of promote decision making, the ability to read, react, and respond to, is it a block? Is it a throw? Is it a reception? And really blending all those skills together, ultimately to try to improve, a catcher's perceptual skills, their ability to make that decision maybe earlier in the process. And although I think that was a noble goal, and I think our guys did get better at the drills themselves, I think research is still pretty fuzzy on how much you can really impact those perceptual skills. I'm sure you can to some degree, but my point is one of the reasons that this position is so hard, especially by traditional methods, is that catchers are always caught in between. And this is why you see this regression in pitch framing with runners on base is because catchers are up in this ready stance or this secondary stance. And pitchers are continuing to evolve and get better. And so this position is not getting easier. It's getting harder than it's ever been. And guys are throwing better breaking balls in terms of movement quality, harder breaking balls, and more of them. And so often, with runners on base and we call it breaking ball and the guy throws a slider that's just below the zone, you see catchers routinely, from these traditional stances that are falling to a knee anyway. And because they're caught in between, is this ball going to bounce? If it is going to bounce, I need to make a commitment, somewhere out of the hand, in that first third of ball flight. I need to make a commitment so I have enough time to execute my move from this up stance down to the ground. Is it not going to bounce? Do I need to prioritize the catch? And so catchers are kind of stuck in this middle ground all the time. And as a result, they don't catch that pitch that is just below the zone that maybe we could convert to a strike, because there's an element of, man, it might bounce and I need to maybe get to the ground to block it. And so they're caught in between. They're hedging between receiving and blocking. And as a result, they lose pitches, at the bottom of the strike zone. And the bottom of the strike zone is key. And the best pitch framers in the game all universally are good down. And I think it's largely because there's just more pitches taken down. When we throw up in the zone, generally we're throwing up to induce swings, and that's becoming a very trendy thing and a very effective thing is the four seam at the top of the zone. And a lot of guys are doing that, but it's not the area we're trying to steal strikes. We're trying to induce swings. So more pitches are taken at the bottom. You're seeing more breaking balls or off-speed pitches are now becoming more predominant than fastballs. And so generally breaking balls, non-fastballs end up down in the strike zone. So there's just more opportunities to receive at the bottom. And so if we're doing anything that compromises our ability to capture those pitches well, then we're costing our team, runs. We're not doing our job effectively. And so what happened when we started exploring these one knee setups and putting guys in one knee positions is now we merged together our receiving and our blocking stances. We didn't have to make a decision in that first third of ball flight or right out of hand. Is this ball going to bounce or not? Do I need to get into this other position to execute, a ball in the dirt? Now our positions are the same. Our block and receive stance are the same. And the only transition is really rolling the glove over and maybe making a slight lateral move, with our torso to try to square the pitch up. So now, because we have less to do, that decision happens way later in the process. And we don't have to make a decision out of the hand. And now we're not hedging between the two. The block now just becomes an extension of the catch. It's not a separate skill. It's catch, 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 all the way up until the last few feet when we recognize it's going to bounce, and we roll over and we make our adjustment from there. So what it's allowed, what I found, and the metrics would line up with this, is that catchers began, optimizing the bottom of the strike zone much better with runners on base. And that had pretty meaningful, compounding impacts over the course of a game, in their overall ability as well.
Now, this is obviously happening at the big league level. There are more and more guys that are trying it out. And it's probably just a matter of time until it starts trickling down to the college ranks, where pitch framing is, certainly important in a lot of scenarios. So I'm curious, are there mistakes that you can see coaches or catchers making as they try to attack some of these new setups? Where you see that, this 19-year-old kid who's going to get it thrown at him, he's going to struggle originally. He's going to think it's the setup and not how it was taught or how it was approached, or he maybe just didn't give it time to actually learn it.
I think it's much more complex, in my opinion and in my experience now, 2+ years into this process. I'm still making adjustments and refining the smallest of details, within this kind of system. I think it's a mistake just to say or make the blanket statement that, hey, if you just get on a knee, you'll be a better pitch framer. And I think, not to say that that's what most coaches are doing, but you are seeing this trend kind of spread throughout the game. And what I would advise is that coaches really dive into trying to figure out, okay, what are the nuances that really matter here? What's the timing of the move? How can we ensure that we do have some lateral range if we do have to block? How do we make sure we're not tipping pitches? We're not only setting up a certain way for certain types of pitches. Can we throw? Can we block? Can we do all these other, secondary skills? But I think if you just, throw them to the wolves and say, hey, get on a knee and framing's the only thing that matters, good luck. If it's in the dirt, just do your best. I think that's, probably not the right approach. I think you still need to teach. We still block every day. Mm-hmm. And again, like I've said, I think blocking is just an extension of catching. It's just an extension of receiving. So it's built into, it's a reception in my mind. So anytime we're doing receiving work, almost always is blended with, occasional balls in the dirt. And we're constantly blending those two skills together. And with that there's a lot of really intentional things that we're doing to make sure we can do both of those things, at a really high level. It's the misconception out there publicly is that, we're just punting. This style is just, we're punting on blocking, we're punting on throwing, and it's all about pitch framing. And although that is true to a certain degree, I still get bothered when we miss a block. Like, it's still personally, I take a hit. Like, man, maybe I didn't prepare them well enough to be able to handle. That's still a part of what catchers need to do at a high level. And so you need to train it and you need to teach it. And, but you need to maybe rethink, some of the absolutes that you've held on to for a long time in terms of what that's supposed to look like. And I think when you can get past kind of the perception of what it looks like and really dig in on, what are the specific, movements that are required to execute that skill from maybe a new position, then you can start, gaining some ground, I think.
I love that. And building on that, right now, obviously the world has come to a halt. They're playing tons of, old games on TV, classics. And so there's a great chance to not just watch elite pitchers, but watch the spectacular catchers that were receiving them. Is there a perfect catcher, or, are there guys in the big leagues that use an example where young catchers would be wise to watch them? And if so, what are you watching for, when you tell someone to go, see someone do their thing?
Just a quick side comment there on the first part of that question. It's, I get texts almost daily from these old time games that are, you see catchers in the 70s and 80s, on a knee, and guys taking screenshots and sending to me saying, hey, see, you're not that smart. You didn't invent this. It's been around for, and which is absolutely true. I didn't invent the one knee setup by any means. I don't claim to. It's been around for a long time. It was just never executed with nobody on, or with runners on base. I think that's where, I think intuitively, even though we didn't have metrics back then, catchers got into those positions because it was comfortable. And I think it'd be naive to say that, hey, they were only doing it because they were tired and they were trying to take a load off, or they were being lazy, or no, that they got into those positions because intuitively it felt right. It felt comfortable. They could get into a really low position where they could, handle the low strike, and no, we couldn't measure it at the time. But you saw a lot of catchers, utilizing it. And now that we have the ability to measure it, and we can say, yes, when we get in these positions, we capture more strikes. Let's do that more often. And let's do it universally in a lot of cases. So, anyway, I think there's a lot of really good examples. I think, I'm biased, obviously, but I think this is a really exciting time for our position. I think you're seeing there's a lot of voices out there. There's a lot of new ideas, good and bad, that are kind of pushing or challenging the status quo and forcing guys like myself to kind of rethink things and explore new ideas. And you're seeing that not only at the amateur level, but at the highest level. You're seeing guys, like Mitch Garver, like now Gary Sanchez, like, you'll see Wilson Contreras doing some new things with what Craig Driver's, he's recently was added to the Cubs staff and doing work there. Rillamudu and the transformation he's made in the past, guys like Tucker Barnhart. Like there's a lot of really good examples of guys who were perceived as, maybe not that good at pitch framing, who have completely transformed, the narrative, but they've taken more of an aggressive approach in the public eye, by experimenting with some alternative methods and are yielding really, really positive results from it. And I think that says a lot about those individual players. And I think it sends a really positive message to amateur players that, hey, there's more than one way to do things. And, it's important that you continue to adapt and evolve as the game does as well. And I think players should be, trying to rediscover or redefine who they are as players, without completely losing their identity, but being open to continuing to grow, I think, is what separates kind of the good from the great.
That's awesome. All right. So when we wrap up, we always do a lightning round. So these are quick questions, and you can be as long as you want with the answer. So
you didn't prep me on this one.
Oh, that's right, man. This is lightning round. You got to be on your toes. So who's a catcher of yesterday? Someone who's retired that we never realized was so good because he played in an era where we couldn't actually quantify how good he was.
Easy. Dan Wilson. I'm a Seattle Northwest homer, so Dan Wilson.
I'm gonna throw it out myself. Craig Alvarez, only because Albie is an amazing guy. He's the bullpen / catching coach for the Giants, and everybody in the Rays organization raved about throwing to Craig all the way up through the minor leagues, and he never sniffed the big leagues because he was undersized. Guy was an amazing receiver and an incredible arm too. So, all right. Albie, we love you. Lessons for a young Tanner Swanson. When you were first coming up as a coach, if you go back in time, what advice would you give to yourself in your first year of coaching?
Be more observant. I think that's something I learned along the way, was to it's okay to take your eyes off your clipboard or your stopwatch and, pay attention to what the player is actually doing and how they're performing. I think I really, took another step in my career when not that I minimized the preparation. You still have a plan going into any session. But the ability to adapt and, evolve, or manipulate that plan based on what you're observing, I think is what makes a good coach. And I strive to do, it's a continual, focus for me is to be really in tune with what's really happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't do that early in my career. It was more about staying on task and getting from drill 4 to drill 5 and X amount of time under, X amount of reps. And it was much more scripted and less organic.
That's awesome. All right. So give me a book that you think every player should read.
The Main Thing, or The One Thing, I think it's called. I can't even tell you who the author is. It's been a year or two since I read it, but it was kind of right in the middle of, my introduction to professional baseball. Just about, really about if you try to tackle lots of different things and you create these to-do lists that are really thorough, that, you really fail to really nail anything, and so for me, it's been about, and I got criticized, and probably continue to be criticized for a long time. People used to tell me, aren't you worried about, you're putting all your eggs in this one basket, as a catching instructor or catching coach, that's how you're perceived. Do you think that's going to hurt you? And for me, it was always like, I'd rather try to be great at something than to be kind of the jack of all trades, or a guy who's a generalist in a lot of ways and does a lot of things okay, but, never really made any real contributions in any one area. And so, this book just kind of reinforces that concept of really kind of becoming hyper-focused on something, striving to master that. And I think that's kind of, it's been good perspective for me to kind of stay in line with, personal goals that I have, and to continue to try to refine my craft.
And I think there's an interesting asterisk that I'm going to add because I've been around. So we first met up in 2015 with Team USA.
Yep.
Sean Cole, to his credit, had you, me, and Matt Blake all on his staff helping out before anybody knew who the heck we were.
Right.
But I would tell you is you spoke languages with every department there, right? You're super well read on the strength and conditioning side of things. You've been in that world, from a skill development standpoint. You just weren't a guy who at age 22 decided you were going to be a catching instructor. Like you were a generalist and then you specialized later. And I think that's an important lesson. Like you have to learn about the psychology of coaching, player interaction, all that stuff before you can just go down one specific rabbit hole really, really deeply. So you need to
Absolutely.
I'm going to put some feathers in your cap in that regard, just to qualify your recommendation.
Yeah. Along a funny story though, 2015, Matt and I were sharing a cot together. Our friend Sean Cole couldn't even get us our own bedrooms. We slept in his room with him side by side on cots, and that was only about 5 years ago. And now we're both working for the New York Yankees. So things can happen fast. It's kind of a cool story.
Absolutely. All right. So last one, if there are any middle school, high school, or college catchers listening to this, what advice would you give them in terms of separating themselves from the rest of the pack?
My half jokingly answer is hit. I think the best way to separate yourself is to improve your offensive profile. I think that is becoming more and more important for the position, especially if we see the adoption of an electronic strike zone. Yeah. It's going to become, a position where if you don't hit, you don't catch. And I think it's already trending in that direction. The two greatest areas where you can impact winning, is pitch framing and is hitting. And I think that's kind of the approach that most scouting departments, I would say, are looking through those lenses in terms of finding players who fit those profiles, not just for professional baseball, but the reason professional scouts are attracted to those skills is because those skills impact winning, and therefore that transcends any level. And if you're trying to really separate yourself as an amateur player to get to college baseball, I think, increasing your offensive profile, will never hold you back, and it'll help get your foot in the door. Teaching hitters is really, really hard. I think I have an easy job relative to, the hitting coaches of the world. I think that's a really tough space, and I have a ton of respect for the coaches out there who do it at a high level, because it's a really complicated problem. And I think hitters in a lot of ways, have always hit, and they've hit from a young age, and you don't get to professional baseball as a poor hitter and then just decide that, hey, I'm going to make this adjustment and figure it out. I think there's outlier guys who have made big transformations and seen great results, but, those guys typically were really good hitters, before they made those adjustments. And so, get in the cage.
That's a great advice, and it's a great place to end this. Wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time. Folks can find you on Twitter. It's at Tanner Swanson. It's always good content. You're good about putting your own stuff out there and retweeting some entertaining stuff. So always contributing back to the body of knowledge. Thanks so much for taking the time, Tanner. This was excellent.
Cool, Eric. Thanks, man. I appreciate you. We'll see you soon, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.